Hello YouTube, I hope you've been doing well. So it's finally fall, even though it doesn't feel like it yet. It's been very warm here in London, so I'm waiting for the sweater weather to set in. But in the meantime, I have 10 book recommendations for you for fall. There is no rule really about when to read any book, but certain books seem to fit the atmosphere of fall, like darker books, dark fantasy books, maybe books bordering on horror. Personally, around this time of year, I like reading very witchy books, very dark fantasy type books. So I compiled a list of my top 10, but in no particular order. So let's hop to it. The first book I want to recommend is actually a series. It's The Raven Cycle by Maggie Otter. It's about a girl named Blue, and she lives in a family of psychics. Personally, I think it's a witch coven, but I don't believe it's actually very explicit. And she encounters a group of 4 boys from the local private school, and their leader, whose name is Gansey, is on this quest to find the Welsh King Glendower, and he's said to grant a wish to whoever finds him. I love this series' portrayal of magic, especially with dreams, and of course of the magical people in this book. I love that this book was so grounded but so trippy at the same time. The characters are amazing and they have such real interactions with each other, but they're getting involved in all these situations with weird mystical forces. I actually really want to reread this series. I finished it last year, but I really want to enjoy these characters again. But I do highly recommend it for fall and just in general, just a series in general, not just a fall series. Next up is Three Dark Crowns by Kendar Blake. I have One Dark Throne, the sequel, with me because my copy of Three Dark Crowns is in the States. I don't have it in the UK with me. But if you don't know, Three Dark Crowns is about an island kingdom that is ruled by a queen, and every queen gives birth to a set of triplets. And these triplet girls each belong to a different magical faction on the island. So there's a poisoner faction, there's a naturalist faction, and an elemental faction. And each faction, of course, is trying to push their own girl to get into that seat of power. It's got amazing magic in it and also amazing political drama as well. It's basically like a matriarchal Game of Thrones, and this has been one of my favorite series in the past 3 or 4 years. I actually have not finished this series yet. I've been meaning to get to the 3rd and 4th books for the longest time, but have just been hampered by all kinds of things. This is a genuinely good series. It takes a little bit to get into the political workings of the world and also the different characters, but it's totally worth it. The next book is going to be so obvious for people who have been watching my channel for a long time, and that's The Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm recommending The Fellowship of the Ring in particular because it feels like a genuinely fall read. It's very cozy in the beginning, but it kind of hints at some of the magic in the world, but then it slowly transitions into this very dark, complicated universe. This book is kind of like a sort of calm before the storm. It's kind of right before that plunge into the night. And of course I recommend the Lord of the Rings series any time of year. I think everyone should read it. The next book is The Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I feel like this was the book that was part of that movement that pioneered that broody romantic vampire trope. So this book is the first book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series. There are a gajillion books in the series. Like, I've lost track of how many books there are, and some books kind of belong into their own sub-series, a little bit like Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I'm not gonna lie, I have not enjoyed the most recent books in this series as much as the early ones. Of course, I'm never one to say don't read these books because I feel like every individual person might get something different out of a book. But of course, I will always recommend Interview with the Vampire, the first book. It's about a newly made vampire called Louis and his maker Lestat. It's basically Louis telling his oral history of his life to this random boy called Daniel who has a recorder with him. But sometimes I reread this book and I'm like, oh, he's such a sulky person. This book has some really colorful characters in it. It's really funny at some parts, and it's just incredibly sad at others. If anyone ever wants to get into vampire fiction or this particular school of vampire fiction, definitely read Interview with the Vampire. Next up is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I've talked about it on this channel, but I've actually met Holly Black. I believe it was in March of 2018. She was kind enough to sign this copy for me and take a picture with me, and of course I felt a little bit awkward about it because I was slightly tipsy at the time, but when I did get around to reading this book, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think I read it in about 24 hours. The main character of the story is a girl called Jude. She has grown up in the land of the fairies because her fairy guardian killed her parents. And this was an act of retribution against her mother, who was the former wife of this fairy. So she lives in the land of the fairies with her twin sister and her older sister, who is actually the offspring of this fairy and her mother. Jude deeply wants to fit in with the fairies but doesn't really know how because they all bully her all the time. I think bully is an understatement. They are actively extremely cruel to her. They push her into all of these almost lethal situations. I don't know, I guess that's what extreme bullying is. But she gets an opportunity from one of the princes of the fairy court to be his spy, and she takes that as a chance to consolidate her own power and status in this world. I loved both the fantasy and political drama in this, and I really love how Holly Black writes fairies. I really love when writers have their own unique interpretations of fairies. They have just enough weird and just enough fun. Like, they are a race of people, but they're different from humans. They have a whole different mentality from humans, and they're alien from humans. Anyway, if you want a good fairy read, this is where it's at. Next on my list is The Diviners by Leigh. This is a really amazing historical fantasy series. It's set during the Roaring 20s in New York. The main character is a girl called Evie who can touch items and sense their history and what they've been through. And she moves to New York just as a series of supernatural murders are occurring, and she decides to use her ability to solve this particular case. I listened to a portion of the audiobook when I was walking home in the evening from getting groceries, and I was so genuinely creeped out that I just kept walking home faster, and I was looking in all the corners of the streets because this was a really frightening book. It's got a really nice mixture of genuine historical authenticity and really great fantastical elements. And Leigh is just generally really good at this. And there's also some really nice diversity in this novel as well. I'm personally really hoping to read the next book, Lair of Dreams, this fall. Next up is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. It's about this college student who gets involved with this really exclusive clique of classic students who study under this one professor. He doesn't quite fit in with them. His financial status doesn't quite fit theirs. They're all kind of quite posh in their own way. So the novel follows this group's shenanigans, and eventually a murder happens. This is a pretty hefty book, but I powered through it because I found the characters so amazing but chilling at the same time. I didn't like anyone in this book, but they just found them so interesting. It's a nice novel for fall for a few reasons. It's very atmospherically and thematically dark, and it takes place in a collegiate environment if you're in a back-to-school mood. Of course, I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm not going back to school. Next book on my list is Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. Really, anything by Neil Gaiman could be on this list, but Norse Mythology is his retelling of a large selection of Norse myths, but he retells them in this really poetic and at times really quirky and funny way. Sometimes he has his own philosophical spin on particular stories. I read this book when I had just moved to the UK, and I listened to the audiobook, and I really enjoyed Neil Gaiman's narration of the stories. In general, I always love when Neil Gaiman narrates his books. He always has such a great storytelling voice, but I immensely enjoyed Norse Mythology. And it's great if you don't want the heft of a novel, but you just want a series of stories. I think Norse myths in particular are just really good for fall. They have their cozy moments, but also their really epic moments. I think the Norse gods are so layered and nuanced, and they have so many dimensions to their personalities. But again, if you don't want Norse myths, read anything by Neil Gaiman. Next up is another book I read this year. It's The Call by Peadar O'Gillen. This book is kind of the Hunger Games with fairies. Basically, in this book, fairies have taken over the nation of Ireland. So Ireland is totally cut off from the rest of the world, and each teenager is taken for a short period of time into the fairy world. And in that short window of time, they have to survive. Fairies will hunt them, and they will do terrible things to them if they are caught. Many do not survive, and the ones who survive are often not the same again. I thought this premise was really cool, especially since the main character is actually disabled. So this is essentially a fantasy novel, but to me it was more horror. So FYI, this book contains a lot of body horror, and it's pretty creative. But if you ever wanted to experience fairies as creatures of horror, then this is the book for you. And finally, I have to recommend Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Longtime viewers of this channel know that I am a huge fan of this series. This novel takes place in Leigh Bardugo's Grisha-verse, and the Grisha are these different elemental magicians. They have different abilities. The characters in this series are so layered and complicated, and they all have their own personal issue that they're dealing with. The primary premise of the story is that there is this group of outlaws in society, and they are contracted to perform a heist of a high security prison. Their leader is Kaz, who is kind of like a teenage Tommy Shelby. Of course, he's my personal favorite. But yeah, I can't say enough good things about this series. I was so emotionally invested. It made me feel all of the things. And of course, atmospherically, it's really gritty, urban fantasy, dark story for dark times. So those were my top 10 fall book recommendations. If there are other books that you like to read in the season of fall, let me know down below. In the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads. Like this video if you liked it, and please subscribe. I am less than 70 subscribers away from 1,000. So if you could subscribe, I would be eternally grateful, and I will see you in my next video.